Thank you very much, Jerry. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to visit Anderson again. Let me ask, how many people here actually live in the city of Anderson proper, in the municipality? And those who don't, you're from elsewhere in Madison County? What other parts? Alexandria? Which one? Lapel. Okay. All right. All right. Well, I got a little idea. I learned a little of the geography around here since I first came last year. All right. And nobody from outside of Madison? Okay. One visitor. Let me ask you one more question. How many people were here when I spoke in, which wasn't here, but at the theater, I guess, in November? Wow. And you came back, too. As Jerry said, the last time I talked about 10 principles of smart growth. This time, I want to talk more about kind of why this matters now and what's going on. And let me say, you're embarking on a process here to think about the future of your community. And, that's really is a big deal. And it's long and arduous. And if it's done right, it's hard. If it's too easy, then you didn't produce anything of value usually. But if you do it well, then it pays off benefits for your community for many years afterwards. And it requires a lot of expertise. And mostly it requires expertise about Anderson and Madison County. And of all the people in the room, I'm the one that doesn't have that. So there are lots of experts here on Anderson. Probably everyone in the room except me, because that really, is about living in a place and, knowing what it is because you experience it every day. And I'm a visitor, and I don't live here, and I don't work here, and I didn't grow up here. So there's very little I can tell you about Anderson. But there are a lot of things going on kind of the, big level of sort of, like weather that blows in and affects everybody in every town in one way or another. And that's the stuff I'm really going to be talking about. It may have different manifestations in this community or another community. It may affect you in slightly different ways. But the stuff I'm talking about is pretty much what is sweeping our country. So it will have some application one way or another. And to all that, then, you have to apply the things that make Anderson unique to figure out how to adapt to that, based on what you have here. I will try to get into some of the question about like what you do, and again, that's more in general terms about best practices and good principles and what's working in other places, which you can take or leave, and that's kind of with all of this. If I've succeeded at the end of at least stimulating conversation and making people think about some things, then I will view that as having been successful. Because again, you guys really have to figure this out. I leave town, and I leave you with the problem of figuring out what your future is going to be. But I have done a lot of this in my own community, and I'd say it is definitely hard, and it is definitely worth it. So with that, I'm with this organization, Smart Growth America. As Jerry said, we do work around the country. We're a nonprofit that envisions a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. We empower communities through technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership to realize our vision of livable places, healthy people, and shared prosperity. That's the commercial. On with the show. So I'm going to start, and some of you heard me say a little about this the last time I was here, with thinking about how we've made communities historically in our in our country from the beginning, when people first started settling the U.S., when Europeans first arrived and started in the East and worked their way across the country, they followed a formula that pretty much reflects the way most cities and towns have been built in the last 5,000 or 10,000 years. They're mixed-use places. They're small, compact, because people had to walk to everything. So things had to be nearby. They had to be mixed use because where I lived needed to be where I would go to the store, where I would go to work, and and that's the way we designed them. And so to do that, they had to be very efficiently built, and that meant a number of things. One is that we really like this grid format for streets because it uses the land really efficiently and it allows things to communicate with relatively small blocks. You can get from thing to thing. And you know, the buildings would have more than one story typically because, again, land is valuable. So you know, in a small place, they wouldn't necessarily be skyscrapers, but you know, a couple of stories gives you a lot more space. And they'd vary in height and so on. And that's the way cities, big and small, were built all across the country for a lot of years. You know, if you pick any place at random, like, oh, say, Anderson, Indiana, and you look at the plan in the 19th century, you get something like that that shows, you know, this same basic form. Orientation to transportation, of course, and being a river, because rivers mattered in a way in the 19th century that we've maybe forgotten about at times because we don't use them quite the same ways. You can see the rail lines and so on. And that was the way we built stuff. Now, in the 19th century, you know, we were an agricultural economy, and you know, farming was basically what the U.S. did. But we then got into the Industrial Revolution in a really big way, and manufacturing came in, and you know, more and more of these cities grew up around manufacturing, and that was really a good thing in terms of all that manufacturing brought to our lives in many ways. But it wasn't entirely a good thing, and of course, it meant that city life changed in a way, whether you're talking about, you know, Manchester in England or, you know, New York City or smaller towns. Factories provided employment, and that was really important, but they also were not necessarily fun things to live right next to, and a lot of this activity had negative consequences for health. Places got more and more crowded as more and more people came off the farm to work in factories in towns that weren't necessarily designed for them, didn't necessarily have the infrastructure they needed, and infectious diseases wound up being the principal cause of death by 1880 or so in cities, because we didn't really have the kind of public health systems that you need for that sort of thing. All of which meant that cities, you know, kind of got to be thought of as places that weren't so great to live in, and you know, they got dirty to some degree, and we wanted out. That's kind of what we wound up doing in the 20th century, which became, you know, more and more about manufacturing in many ways in terms of what was driving the economy. But the cities became the places, you know, people lived who didn't have the choice, and more people wanted to go out to the you know, the leafy pastures beyond and, you know, live a little bit more in the country. That's what we thought anyway. And we did really make this happen after World War II. It was just sort of an ideal for a lot of decades, but we had the Depression that slowed things down for, you know, a dozen years, and then World War II. And at the end of that, we had a combination of factors that made it really possible to actually do this thing. And that was, you know, changes in technology, first and foremost being the automobile, and an economy rich enough to produce them for everyone to actually have one. We had this odd demographic thing because of the Depression and World War II. There was a long period of time when people put off a lot of things, including having children. And so by the time guys are coming back from World War II, you have people of different ages starting families. And so you have this sort of demographic anomaly where all of a sudden there's this big, well, boom in babies, hence baby boomers. And that's a really historically unusual thing. So all of a sudden, in historical terms, you have this tremendous generation of people who are starting families, who, you know, mom, dad, and a few kids, winds up actually being the way the country is growing disproportionately. So that had an implication for the kinds of things people were looking for, like where do I want my house, where do I want to live? Well, where do I want to raise my kids? And what do I need? Well, I need enough room, you know, for the family of 4+. And at the same time that happened, the third thing was we changed all the rules. So all the ways that cities and towns have been built before now got changed because it was the 20th century, it was modern, we did everything the modern way, and, you know, we didn't need to look back. And again, I think, you know, partly this is because the Depression had such an impact. People went through, you basically had a lost generation of doing a lot of stuff between Depression and the war. And so new was better, whatever it was. And so many things were run down because they didn't get investment in, and we just, you know, leave them behind. And we do so we're building new places, and we're building by brand new rules. And the new rules really created a different kind of place than human beings had ever lived in 5,000 or 10,000 years of living in cities. And these are, this is the suburbs. This is, we're going to go out and live in a place where it's not crowded. And we have a new way to make them, and that's why this new idea of zoning that came in, which was based first and foremost in making sure you don't live next to smelly, nasty things that could be dangerous, and aren't pleasant. And the big thing is we don't have to walk anymore. We can drive everywhere. And our rules for building places are all designed, because the city didn't accommodate that. They weren't built for everybody having a car driving all over the place. So now we're going to make it so that it does. So modern planning meant, things built around a car. And instead of having grids, we have this sort of hierarchy of streets that go to, dead ends or cul-de-sac, because that sounds a lot better in real estate terms than saying dead end. And in part that's because you can only build so much of this because we're spreading things more out, and you can only afford so much asphalt and so on. And we don't really think about walking because, well, why would you do that anymore? We don't have to. So we left, and we took population out of the city, and again, it was partly understandable reasons why people would have wanted this as the new American dream. It wasn't the American dream before about 1950 or so, but it became the American dream, and we were told that was the American dream. And we had a whole lot of stuff that made it happen. I mentioned zoning, so that's government at the local level. But then you had a whole lot of federal laws, including federal housing laws that, facilitating a whole bunch of people in the GI Bill similarly to be able to go out and buy a house for the first time. And that's fine, but they paid for you to move to that new suburb. They didn't provide that money if you were, going into, an old place in town necessarily. We had programs like urban renewal, which was basically about cutting down those places. There was the actions that killed the streetcar systems, the transit systems on which these towns were built, and so on and so on and so forth. The mortgage introduction, you go through all of it. We had a whole lot of policy, federal, state, and local, that was aimed at building these new places and abandoning those old ones. And a lot of money went into that. The highway bill in particular, of course, facilitated all these places. And that meant that the federal government was giving essentially 90 cents on the dollar to states, just writing the check. And you build, you figure out what you want to build with it, which, is a nice deal. And we did build lots of them. So there's that part. Then at the local level, there's this zoning thing that created this new rules, which, as I said, separate uses. Industry goes over here, commerce goes here, residents go over here. You need your civic things, and they're all connected by an arterial road that we're going to drive to and from. Now, it turns out when we do a lot of these things, that arterial road is not quite the same free experience behind the wheel that they show on the ads for the cars, but that's the idea. It's oriented to driving and separating everything out. And so, now we live in, places like this. This is the ideal kind of community. Again, it's only one way in and one way out, and you better be in an automobile. We moved our businesses out to these new places. If you want to buy something, you get everything you want out there in this box that's surrounded by parking, lots of parking, so you can get there and fill up your station wagon or whatever. And our work, well, again, similarly, lots of parking. We drive to where we have to go to the office. If you need anything outside the building, probably want to get in your car. And we left behind these places that used to be the centers of commerce and community. And as best we could, we made sure the cars could speed right through them as quickly as possible. We left behind neighborhoods that were oriented toward walking and toward our neighbors. The buildings sort of talk to each other here, and you can just imagine, running into Mrs. McGillicuddy down the street, coming at her door as you come when she's walking her dog or whatever. You can't really picture that in a place like this, which we were building in the 90s, which again is very efficiently designed for the automobile to live in, and somewhere behind there for the automobile's owner to also have a place to stay. You don't need sidewalks because, why? And, these neighbors may or may not know each other or talk to each other, but that's not really what it's about. But this is great because we got everything we wanted in those houses, right? We got everything in the house, and we need anything, we just have to go drive. And so, this was wonderful, and we adjusted our lifestyles to meet this new reality. And it's interesting because it really is a dramatic shift that most of us, we lived on one side of that. We didn't necessarily all experience what it was like before. We see them mostly in older places that either look rundown or charming, depending on what you're looking at, but definitely not modern. Now, a friend of mine who's a professor at George Washington University and a guy with a lot of experience in development, he wrote a book a few years back called The Option of Urbanism. His name's Chris Leinberger, and he's done a lot of work on this. And part of what he talks about is how all this culture is reflected in the TV shows. In the 50s and 60s, all the TV shows were about mom, dad, and a couple of kids. Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver. All these shows. Lucy and Ricky moved to the suburbs, right? It reflected it. And more recently, that's kind of changed. But one of his favorite things is movies, and also mine. So I don't know if this is going to work or not. We'll have to find out if it does. But so there was. Do you remember this picture, Back to the Future? And there was this. This guy goes with this DeLorean in a car, appropriately enough, right? He goes back in time, and let's see if this works. So the sound won't be really great, but mostly it's just what you see. So here he is arriving, shocked in 1955, and what does he see? This is the town square, right? Look at all the people walking through the square. They're all around, and there's business there, and there's the whatever that is, City Hall or library. That's the way it is in 1955 that he lands himself in. And of course, if you remember this story, of course he's trying to get back to his own time. And so he gets back to 1985 and jumps out of his DeLorean, and look what he sees. And he's so happy to be back in. And where does he go? Let's see where he goes. This is 1985 now. Sorry. Where it is, he goes to the mall, of course, because it's 1985, right? And what was that mall called? Lone Pine Mall. I wonder what that's named for. Maybe there was a pine tree they cut down to build the mall, and they named it in honor. That's about right. That's about the shift from 1955. It's 30 years. And we had a complete revolution in the way people lived. That was the way it was always going to be. We're going to keep moving out, and these city things. This was in the past. This was done. Except that things started to change sometime in the late 90s. As we got into the 21st century, it started being obvious that things were changing. We've seen companies moving back into town in recent years. In fact, many of them doing the opposite. And I didn't say this, but companies were moving out from the 1950s. By 1970, the majority of American jobs had left the cities and moved to the outskirts. And then from 2000 to 2015, we did a study and found 500 cases of companies moving back into town. So, we looked into that and we interviewed them and asked them about why, and I'll say some things about that. But this was happening. They were moving into town. Now, what's happening with people is that not everyone is necessarily moving to town, and part of the issue, of course, is who can afford moving into town, depending on where town is. But what's notable in particular is that millennials who have education, and Gen Xers too, pretty much, they're moving into urban centers. And in earlier generations, they were doing just the opposite. This is from a book that came out about a year ago called Suburban Remix. The cost of houses in cities, the values of housing on a per square foot basis, has risen 66% faster in cities than in suburbs in the last decade and a half or so. And again, the opposite of what was happening for decades before that. Office rents, same thing. This is a change in what we had experienced for many years. Walkable places are at a premium. You pay more for them, or if you own them, you get to receive more from them, whether it's for living, retail, or office. And there are a lot of different studies. I just want to show this one thing because I think it's cute, and I don't know if Jerry mentioned, but I'll confess now. So I'm an economist by training. Hope that he doesn't run for the door now. as well as being a recovering politician. And you have to have graphs, so it's the law. So I don't know how hard this is to follow, but basically this is something you can get it's on the internet. Moody's has this facility on a website, and what they did was they took all the different classes of commercial property. They took a cut where they said, let's group the ones that are in suburban drive-only places. Let's group the ones that are in downtowns. Let's group the ones that are in walkable suburbs, because some suburbs are more walkable than others, and basically on a scale. And so there's like 5 different groups here. Totally car-dependent suburb, somewhat walkable, highly walkable 4, and then there's the US aggregate. And what they did was they said, index that to 2001 and see what happened. Well, what happened was the values of everything the economy was really strong in 2001, 2002, 2003, up to 2008, and then there's the crash, right? And this is the Great Recession. So you see all these values go up, they all go down. But what you might notice is the blue ones, which are the walkable places, they're rising faster than the car-dependent ones. Then the crash happens, everything goes down, but look what happens. The car-dependent places went down more than the walkable places. And coming out of the recession, the gap opened up. Everything goes back up, but the walkable and highly walkable places grow more than the car-dependent places. So it's a trend that has survived this incredible business cycle. And that shows it was happening before, and it continues through and afterwards. Now, it's not just about big cities, and I want to make that point again and again. We're seeing the traditional main streets have been coming back all around the country in cities of sizes of 5,000, 10,000 people. This is a city of about 10,000 people in western Pennsylvania, for instance, with a very energized main street, from end to end, and you can walk for like a mile, and it's real busy. So why is this happening now? Why did we see this change when everything was cruising along? Well, a lot of it has to do with the economy and technology, and a lot of it has to do with demographics. So there's this shift from the manufacturing economy to the knowledge economy, and that has impacted things in a lot of different ways. And then there's the demographic changes of the retirement of the baby boom and the rise of the millennial generation, and there's some different preferences involved there. The economy, again, in the 20th century, it was driven by manufacturing, and economic development was driven by, they call it chasing smokestacks. You wanted to attract the big factory, but a lot of that depended upon where you happen to be located, relative to resources, because manufacturing needs resources, so natural resources played a big role. What's happened now is, with so much of the economy dependent on knowledge, the natural resource is people with skills, people with particular training. So it goes where they are, and they go where they want to go. There's a lot on this. I'm just going to speed through some of this. This is, some executives identifying that what used to be, highway access and cheap labor was where people wanted to locate. Now they're looking at skilled labor as being the driver. Talent is replacing the tax incentive as the #1 economic development tool in America, so said the chairman of the Florida Chamber of Commerce. And again, I said the demographics has a lot to do with this. These 2 generations of the millennials and the baby boomers, it's like 150 million people when you put it together, and that's a big move of a lot of people, half the U.S. population basically. And it turns out at the moment they're both more interested in more compact places that are more walkable for perhaps different reasons. Well, millennials are a different kind of generation. They, this is people who, I'm using the definition, people who reached adulthood sometime around 2000. There's been a lot of, so the industry brims with theories on what makes millennials tick. Well, when baby boomers were the big generation, we were the ones that everybody studied, the psychologists, the sociologists, and the marketers in particular. Now they're all interested in what millennials think, and they've, come to agree on certain things about them that everybody knows. Oops, no, I didn't mean that, sorry. That's what I meant, yeah. Millennials decide where they want to be, and then they go looking for a job, whereas other generations would have gone where the job was. And so this is really significant for location decisions for business. And where they want to be are places that are walkable. National Association of Realtors has done a lot of work on this because they advise people who have to sell them houses And we're seeing this over and over again. They, again, have some different preferences. They're more into experiences than things, which means they don't necessarily care as much about having as big a house, as much space as earlier generations did, but they want access to things they can do. They buy more than they rent. They rent more than they buy, rather. And my daughter sent me this thing that I guess is some kind of, is this Twitter? I don't know. I'm not a millennial. But if you ever watch Wheel of Fortune, like to buy a vowel, aren't you a millennial? So I'd like to rent a vowel. Okay. All right, it's not that good. And they don't really like cars the way we did. I mean, I certainly saved every penny I had so the day I was eligible to drive, I could get a car. And I've told people I have 3 kids. They all were late in getting a driver's license. My youngest didn't get a driver's license until she was 25, and I don't think she's driven a day since she got the license. But that's what it was for us. We had to have the car because this was, and apparently those haircuts too. But I deny that there's a photograph of me anywhere that looks anything like that. I'm pretty sure I burned them all. But this was your key to social life. Was having a set of car keys, whereas now they've got one of these, and that's everything you need. And they don't feel the same way about it. They want other ways to get around, and they have other ways to get around. So housing-wise, again, the realtors looked at it and said, what kind of place do you want to live? You want to live in a place where you don't have to drive at all, where it's big city kind of thing. And almost half of them said, yeah, I want that. Interestingly, about 40% of them said, no, I want a small town or a rural place. But it's a town they want. They want to actually have a place where they can go to a coffee shop that has internet and hook up with other people and so on. Interestingly enough, only about 12% of them want to live in the car-oriented suburb. I think that's interesting because almost all of them grew up in a place like that. And that's apparently not what they're looking for. And so not surprisingly, that's where communities are going. Because, as this story said, young, smart people like dense, walkable communities, so top companies are moving there. We did the study I mentioned, and we asked these executives, why did you choose to move? In this case, this one is a president of a company, a software company in Cleveland. He said, our younger employees don't want to go to a suburban office park. It's boring as all get out there. Here they walk outside and see cool stuff, and it's fun. I wanted to be where they want to be. And then there's us, those of us who are of this great generation that is steadily retiring, but we're not ready to quit. It's a pretty active group of people that's going to be the largest retired generation in history, and we are more active than earlier. We're also a bit more healthy and expected to live 30 more years than people 50 or 60 years ago were going to live. That affects what we want to do. It also means that there's a demand for smaller houses than there would have been, because that's a long period of time you're now living where there's just 1 or 2 of you, as opposed to the period of time when you're raising your kids. So again, source of demand for smaller housing. Again, we want to do different things. We will live longer than people should drive. I forget something. I heard some statistics, something like the average American man would live something like 11 years beyond when he's really able to drive, which doesn't mean we won't do it, but you probably don't want us out there driving anyway, so good if we have some other alternatives, and we really would like to. If you look at that basically means there's a whole lot of people leaving houses like this, and let me say, there are still going to be lots of people who want this house. That will still be the dream for a lot of people, and that's fine. The problem is we built a whole lot of that stuff. And there aren't as many people for us to sell those houses to, coming on up. And that's part of the difficulty. So they're downsizing, we're downsizing. I haven't downsized yet. I still have 3 empty bedrooms where my kids used to be, but they're out at one of these days, something like this or this. Because more and more older folks are deciding, an apartment in town would be okay. No lawn to mow, that would be great. So when you put these two together, we've got these starting out households, and you've got these downsizing retirees. They account for a huge portion, according to this one study, 84% of the new housing market by 2035. So that's a whole lot of people looking for basically a different product than is mostly on the market right now. And again, I want to make the point that we're not just talking about what people want in New York, Chicago, or San Francisco. We're seeing this all over the place, and lots of smaller towns around the country are taking advantage of this, or just finding that, well, the apartments upstairs are suddenly rented out, and people are making money at them, and their main streets are coming alive, and it's hard to find a place that you'd want. Irwin, Tennessee is up in the mountains. Rifle, Colorado has fewer than 10,000 people out on the western slope. There are lots of examples like this. And just in case somebody wants to say, well, isn't this going to change? And the millennials put off having kids because of the recession. They're going to start doing that. They're going to just behave like, their parents did, and we're really going to go back to the same thing. Now, I don't think so, because I think their preferences really have changed. But this is an important demographic point that suggests that even if they did, we still would have a different situation. And the reason for that is this change in the population. If you look at 1960, this is called a demographic pyramid, and the bottom is like, the bottom bar is aged 0 to 5. So it's the population, males in one direction, females in the other direction, and that's the population 0 to 5. So the next one is 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and so on, all the way up to 85. So, or 85 and over. And if you look at, this is the way in history most of this would tend to look. You had a bunch of young people die, and by the time you get to the older age, there's not as many people, so it's a pyramid. That's what it was. This is the baby boom generation in 1960 right here. Here's looking forward to 2040, where the baby boom generation is out here, and notice how the shape has changed. And again, that's the combination of longevity more than anything else, and changing birth rates. And you get something that is almost a rectangle. And there's only a small period in there in which people are actually raising kids, and they do have smaller families, fewer kids in general now anyway. So that suggests that this is a long-term trend, even if the younger generation suddenly decided they wanted to do what we did in earlier decades. All of this means that there's a big mismatch between the population, the housing supply we have and the population we have, with 62% of our stock being single-family detached housing, and only 22% of our households or so being married couples with children. Now, from that, I want to talk about one kind of last aspect of this, which is that it turns out that all that development of these kind of spread out communities that were dependent on cars had a nasty effect that we didn't really anticipate, which is that they're expensive. It turns out that how you develop, the pattern of settlement, as demographers and geographers might call it, has an impact on what it costs to run government, to provide services. And that turns out to have a real impact in these kind of communities that we built. That the costs of whether it's providing routine government service, building facilities, and so on, a lot of that is driven by how spread out you are. So if we look at the traditional town, like this Vermont town here, where houses are relatively close together. I mean, you wouldn't think of this as this ain't a big city, but it's comparatively dense as opposed to this, let's say late 20th century McMansionville, with just a few houses spread out along a lot of asphalt. And if you think about it, the asphalt represents the public space that has to be paid for by everybody's taxes. And you're not spreading it out over very many taxpayers. Of course, it isn't just the asphalt and the maintenance of this road, the plowing of it in the winter and all that kind of thing. It's also the stuff that goes under the road that provides water to our homes and takes water away from our homes. It's also, delivering school children back and forth on school buses. It's picking up the garbage. It's the police and the fire and all those things. So that turns out to actually matter. And sprawl is expensive because delivering services here is less efficient with the greater amount of area you have to cover. One aspect of this that's kind of interesting, and again, the way it's kind of hidden, is that if you think about something like water, most places you pay for water on a per gallon usage. There's a per gallon charge, and you use more water, you pay more. Thing is, you generally will pay the same rate no matter where you are, no matter which part of town you happen to be in. So what we mean is that the actual rate is an average per capita. It's whatever the average cost of a gallon is. But it turns out that if you live in a high density place, it costs less than the average to bring the water to you. If you live in a low density place, it costs more. So this means that, number one, the people who live in the high-density area are subsidizing the people who live in the low-density area. In my experience, those are people who complain about their taxes and never think about the fact that they're getting subsidized. But it also means that we have set up incentives. As I said, a lot of this is the result of government policy. This is essentially incentive. It hides the cost of more spread out development and burdens the more dense place. On the revenue side as well, low-density suburban style development generates less revenue per acre, and whereas the main streets and dense mixed-use areas create a lot of synergies, that means they're more valuable than just the individual parts. And so we see we do work where we look at the revenue that's generated across, say, a city or a county, and we see where it spikes, and you can always tell where downtown is. And the interesting thing is that the disparity is tremendous. It's usually like 5% of the land will generate 30% of the revenue, even in a small town that's not doing that great. In a place that's really humming, it might be 50% of the revenue. But the hot spots pop out, and they tend to be downtown. Now, you will have some hot spots that are like your high-end suburban shopping center or mall or something like that that's doing really well. But it's amazing how you can look at that, and sometimes the downtown that's relatively vacant still has higher values. We found this, the first time I saw it, I think it was in Macon, Georgia, we did this work. And the downtown has tremendous vacancy, but it's just starting to come back. And then out of town, they have this big fancy, this is where the rich people live on the north side of Bibb County, and this is where the big fancy shopping centers are and all that, the drive-to places. And those places generated a lot of revenue. They generated like 700,000, 800,000 per acre. But downtown was over $1 million per acre, even with all the vacancy. So, again, there's this fiscal side to this. When you put the two together, what's the net fiscal impact? The revenue minus the cost of delivering services. A lot of places, it turns out, are developing new communities, new subdivisions that will cost more to serve than they will get in revenue, which means everybody else basically has to subsidize that new development. But it's all hidden, so you never think about it, you wouldn't notice it, which is why we encourage people to do such analysis. Okay, so when you look at all those things, there are implications, and some of them, obviously, we have a lot of companies moving. We have suburban office buildings that don't seem to be viable anymore. We have the people who advise the people who own that property telling them walkability and activated environments are on top of what you have, and your suburban office may be obsolete. We have, obviously, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, an awful lot of suburban homes that were built that couldn't be sold. And we have empty shopping areas all over the place. People say we're over-retailed in part because we build so many of these things that there's not enough business for, particularly in the age of e-commerce. But altogether, the shopping mall was a great, glorious thing, and not so much anymore. They've stopped building them. There's a few of them still doing well, but mostly not. And what it really means is that communities in the United States are in a tremendous competition over place making, over having a sense of place, because that's driving so much of the economic decisions being made on a national level. And they're in that whether they realize it or not. So the simplest advice to give to folks wondering what do we do to make our place competitive again, viable again, is foster distinct, attractive communities with a strong sense of place. That attracts the people who are drawing the companies. I mean, that's the short and simple formula, but of course, life is more difficult than that, and actually getting there and doing that is a lot harder, but this is what, in many ways, it comes down to. So we've done a number of things to help people find a way to do this in their own communities. We have a handbook. We've studied places that seem to be applying this successfully for examples, and we highlighted 6 of them in a study called Amazing Place. And I note that these are not, again, this isn't Boston, this isn't San Francisco. There are places like Denver, which really does stand out, and Minneapolis, Nashville, and Pittsburgh, which are good-sized cities. They're not as big as New York or LA, but they're big cities. But they also include smaller places like Boise, Idaho, and Greenville, South Carolina. Greenville, South Carolina has a slightly smaller population than Anderson, Indiana, but it is an example of everything. You know, if I give you the playbook of all the stuff you could think about doing, they have done just about everything that we would recommend doing, and they are having a result that I don't know of another example of a city of under 100,000 that's.
I'd like to make a comment about that.
Sure.
We did a large event in the Gate for Music Company. We did a large event in Greenville in the fall, and we have an elder clientele, and they did everything right, from the hotels to the Visitors Bureau to the Chamber of Commerce. Anytime they have a group coming in, and we have, I think, 6,000 attendees.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, we have an elderly clientele, a lot of walkers, a lot of wheelchairs. And as a community, I mean, those restaurants, if people couldn't get to them, they found ways to get them there. And I was really impressed with that. It made me come back thinking, how do we as a community have that same attitude? The businesses really, I mean, like, they were months before our event took place contacting us saying, how can we contact your customers to make sure they dine at our restaurant or that they stay in our hotel? Or, I mean, it was very impressive that they were very eager and aggressive in a good way, trying to they really sell their city. So, I mean, I'm looking at that list and I'm thinking, these are big. I mean, Nashville's huge. You know, Nashville, Tennessee is not Anderson, Indiana. But Greenville, yeah, that makes sense to me.
I mean, I think Nashville's a good comp for Indianapolis, but Greenville's a comp a city like Anderson could look at and say, because, you know, not too many years ago, no one talked about Greenville, South Carolina. You know, I mean, I knew people who grew up there and thought it was a nice place once upon a time too, but, you know, outside of that, and now, you know, every place I go, there's always somebody in the room who is there and goes, yeah, you know. And in fact, you've got a business here in town. It's the distillery. Those folks came from Greenville. And last time I was here, I met him, and I said, so you're in Greenville, why here? And he said, because I want to do this kind of thing, and it's too hard to do now in Greenville because it's already happened. It's already successful. I want to go to the next place that's going to do that. And he said, and I think Anderson could be that place. So, you know, these are the seeds from which success can grow. All right, well, I only want to talk for a little bit more because I really want to get to you talking and telling me what you think. But I'm just going to quickly throw out a bunch of stuff about what you do. And I, say that if I got to boil it down to 4 things, because more than that gets hard to remember, I'd say you need a plan that everybody agrees to. We're going to do this, and it covers a lot of years and has short-term, medium-term, long-term, but you got to get organized around a plan, which, as I understand it, is the process you're embarking on here that Jerry is referring to. And then within that, it's make a place. Create that place people will say, oh, that was a neat place I saw there, and want to come back to. A place your kids will want to come back to, by choice when they've gone away and gone somewhere else in the world. Then when you have your plan that's going to give you that place, you've got to make all the rules line up for that. Because I told you the stuff we have didn't just happen because people all of a sudden decided they wanted to do it. It happened because we had a whole lot of policies to make it happen. We had new rules about what people could build and where they could build. We had subsidies and tax policies and all these things to create that world. If you want to create something different, you got to change those rules. Because most of the rules that are in place in most places still are oriented toward that auto-oriented, auto-centric sprawl world. It's hard to do the kind of things we're talking about, like to rebuild a downtown, because there are some inherent difficulties in building infill, but also because we make it hard. We make it difficult to do what we want people to do. And then the last thing is just, you do actually have to have an economy to drive this. There's a reason cities exist, and somebody's got to be making money on something. And when you've had a big change, and a shock like the loss of a major employer or an industry, the question's got to be what's going to take its place and how you're going to do that, and that has to be part of strategizing too. But there's a lot of ways to do this. A lot of places do it, and they're not all. We did some work in Anchorage, Alaska, and they came up with a bunch of things in order to do this, and they're working on a whole downtown plan. since we were there a few years ago. And it's just, one example. Again, I said it's about walkability, so create a walkable community. And again, there are some simple, there's a lot of details, but there are some basic simple rules in that you gotta have density for this thing to work. It doesn't mean you have to be Hong Kong, but you have to be like what Anderson was 60 or 70 years ago. And that means that there are people here and things to do, and you have to have a mix of uses, because where I live, I need to be able to get all the other things I want. So I need to have those things in close proximity. And you need to have really good design, because the way we've stamped stuff out to put them out in suburbs is, kind of haphazard. It doesn't have to be that good. Just have ample parking and, point me to the door. But if things are going to live next to each other in a city, then it matters. We have to have a design that is actually creating a place people will want to be and want to walk around. If you bring the suburban design into the city, you destroy the city. And there are a lot of examples of that. There are small examples, like a parking garage or two you could find walking around here. But there are cities that have really done it. I was at a city in North Carolina a couple weeks ago where they have a great industry, and it's showrooms for furniture, because they have a big international market that happens twice a year. The whole downtown is occupied by these buildings that replace those lovely old buildings they used to have, and they're big blocks of concrete that fill the entire block and go up many stories and have no windows or doors around the whole thing. There's just the one entrance, and you're only going if you're invited in, and there's block after block of this stuff, and it's not a place you really want to walk around, and now it's a problem for them. So, there are rules to this, and design matters. I'm going to go through this far too fast for you, so, don't try to take notes here. The material will be available if you want to look at it, if you want to learn more, but I really just want to give you a feel for this, that there are things you can do, there are steps you can follow that can lead you to a better place. Which means that, we have a walkable place is not just about sidewalks, it's about the buildings, because if there's nothing there, if there's no street wall there, it's a nice sidewalk, but why would I want to walk there? Our towns are full of these spaces. This is not your town. I did not take this picture here, but I'm sure you could go out there and take this picture. Most towns got them. Where we used to have buildings, and now we have parking, and that means that the experience of walking down the street is interrupted, and it's not that lively. Or we have buildings that we did things like this to. This was plunked down. This is an example of a suburban building plunked in an urban site. This is near my house. This was, of course, an old grocery store that closed and was always blank like this. As I told people before, we really didn't have pedestrians. This was done as we were planning what to do about this, and those people were photoshopped in so you could actually get a sense of scale. There were not actually any pedestrians there. There are now, because now we have a building that has storefronts and residents over it. So, position of the building is really important. And again, these rules, you can get them. You don't have to memorize them now. But a few of them are really important. Orienting the building to the street, not having blank walls, this stuff I've been saying. Again, this is the building that's in place of that one that had the photoshopped people. And, this has activated frontage. This is what you don't do. This is what we used to do. Again, the rules we had in place, and almost everybody who does, makes you do this. It said they had to have a certain amount of parking, and they could put it there. Sidewalks here, parking's here, buildings here. That's what you don't want to do. Complete streets is about streets that are accommodating to all users, not just cars, and streets where hopefully you'd feel safe having your kids walk to school. It's not just about a sidewalk. And again, this is Hamburg, New York. Is a smaller town than Anderson in upstate New York. They had a street that was 4 lanes racing through town, and then they did this work to make it a place where these businesses can and want to thrive. Public spaces, there are a lot of different kinds of things you can use. What assets do you have? If you've got a town square, this one in Bentonville, Arkansas was a dead place. It's now very lively because of everything that's been done around it. Old buildings, like this one in Conway, Arkansas. Or natural sites. This is a place in Colorado, in southwestern Colorado, Pagosa Springs, where they have a stream, a river that goes right through town, and they brought themselves closer to it and made it something people will want to come and enjoy. In very little places like this town of a couple thousand people in the Berkshires, the old general store might be the thing that brings everybody in. The idea is to figure that out. What are your unique assets that you can leverage? Are they old buildings? Are they old warehouse districts? Maybe manufacturing facilities? Are they natural features? There's something. Every town's got something. And you got to get people living downtown. This is the single biggest thing, I think, that determines success. I mentioned Greenville. There are lots of places punching above their weight, but they're one of the best examples. But whether we're talking about Denver or Greenville, the big change in recent years is people live in the downtown. Denver now has 70,000 people living downtown. It was probably not 5,000 back in the 80s when I first went there for work. And it's just live now. Greenville had a few hundred people living there, I think the mayor told me. They now have 5,000 people. That's in a town of 65,000. 5,000 people living in your downtown, that's a lot of residents. You walk down in the street 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and there are people on the street and there are lights on above, which of course makes you feel perfectly fine walking around the street. These things play together. So you've got to get people to live there, which means you need to have that. You need to have housing, and you have to have things that make them want to live there. You need different kinds of housing for folks, as we said. We don't have enough attached housing. We don't have enough semi-attached housing. We don't have enough small houses on small lots nearby. That can be said pretty much for any town. If you want that, you got to make it possible for people to build that sort of thing or renovate old places. And then there's the bit about managing it. One of the things that the suburbs did teach us and the malls did teach us is it makes a difference to have somebody in charge of caring for the place all the time. So making sure it's clean, it's safe, it's fun, there are activities going on, all these things the mall managers did. And in recent years, people have been applying that to their main streets and creating different kinds of organizations like business improvement districts, and there are nonprofits that do it, and there are cities that do it themselves. But somebody has to be responsible for every morning caring about this place. The main street or the local or the downtown district, whatever it is. Who cares to see that it's safe, that it's clean, that says there's going to be activities and programs them so that we have things to bring people and show it off. And again, these are all different sized places. Baltimore's a big city, but Franklin, Tennessee is, I think, around 10,000 people, 15,000 maybe. And somebody here I spoke to earlier today knew about this Dickens Christmas thing they do every year. I don't get this, but apparently it's a really big deal and a great lot of fun, and people come every year for it. So, that somebody has to be thinking about that all the time. And then people start remembering that they go to that town for that event, whatever it is, and they learn other things about it, and it builds on itself. Even daily activities, in public spaces. Who's going to do that? So let me just talk a little bit about, and I'll after this I'll just stop and ask for questions. But if we look at a place, and everybody's got a street that looks something like this. How do you feel about that place? Is that a place you really want to go? Would you say, gee, I'd love to be there right now? No, how do you feel about this place? You think you might want to go there? If you found out your kid was living here, that might be okay, maybe? So this is the same place, actually. So what is it that we don't like about this version of it? Well, let's see. You got buildings that are not very friendly, of course. You've got big parking lot, so this is like vacant, essentially, here. You've got a street that is really about moving cars as fast as possible through there. So it's wide. The sidewalk, on the other hand, is narrow. There's not much space there to walk, and so it's telling you it's not really for you, it's really for the cars. Now, suppose we do something to change it, including bringing in new buildings, because as I said, you need a street wall. So instead of having this emptiness here, you have activity. It's a 3-story building. It's not a skyscraper, but it is a multi-story, 4-story building. But it means you can have retail on the ground floor. You can have people living above or offices above. And, there's activity right there on the street now. Now, I don't know if you saw that, but saw where the sidewalks were? Well, suppose we bring the sidewalks out. We make the crossings clearer and not so far across. We provide for bicycles. Now it's a little bit more accommodating. And we put in trees to give us some shade and lighting. The street is narrower, but it's really got the same capacity. It'll move plenty of cars. They probably won't be going as fast, which is a good thing. And over time, more fills in, it gets more active, and becomes an even better place. Now, of course, it also becomes more expensive probably because now everybody wants to live here. So I say at this point, you need a strategy for housing affordability so that everybody will be able to live there. And that's the sort of thing. You'll go along a long way thinking, how do we get anybody to want to live here? And then all of a sudden, everybody wants to live there. It's amazing how fast that changes. I've seen that happen in my own community. So you do have to plan for that too. But compare that to these places in the suburbs that we built so much of. But there are these places that, again, have been revived. Again, this is an example in Greenville of where people live over. This is an example of leveraging a community asset. They had a waterfall in the middle of town that nobody knew about because the highway went over it. So the mayor said, I want to tear down that highway bridge and put in a pedestrian bridge so people can look at the waterfall. That people thought he was crazy, but he went and did it. Turned out there was no traffic consequence whatsoever, but everybody knows the waterfall in the middle of Greenville now. They fixed up that led to fixing up the area along the river, which was formerly industrial. So you can walk along that, and that led to buildings all along here. And this is the same. This is looking the other direction from where I was. As you can see, this is the old downtown stuff. This is all new housing, offices, shops. And the river is now a beautiful asset. River also is an asset in places like Chattanooga, where they had a highway, and they connected the town to the water. Or even places where you don't have much in Normal, Illinois, they just took an intersection and created what's like a big roundabout and park, which is now a center of community. And along with that, they fixed up some of the older buildings, and it's become another place. But the point is, you have to really be thinking ahead for this. You have to be planning for it. And everybody has to commit to some kind of vision. And then it will take time, because it does take time. But I think it can pay off if you're willing to work at it. And if it's your hometown, then maybe it's a place you do want to spend a long time and maybe have a place your kids will be able to come back to. But that's up to you. Or you could not do it. And so with that, I will stop and entertain any questions, arguments, challenges anyone may have. Who wants to go first?
You were talking about time just a few minutes ago or a minute ago. South Carolina, how long did that reformation take?
Okay, so they did some things starting in like the 80s, where they fixed up the main street quite a bit, and they a lot of those trees. I saw one picture that's where there's really old trees. I think that was the previous mayor. They had two great mayors over a period of like 35 years. So Knox White is the mayor now, has been in like 20 years. But before him, there was another guy who was in for a long time, and he did that initial work. Most of what you see that I showed, though, all happened since the late 90s. A lot of it occurred in the last 10 or 15 years. So, I would say a really good project, it takes 20 years to really see something happen. But the first things happen, within a few years, and you see those. And that's a big part of this, is figuring out how you can plan something that has that long-term vision. When it's all built out, it's going to be great. But what are we getting to along the way? And you do have to have things where people get a return on investment, whether we're talking about private investors or just everybody, because everybody in the community who's going to spend time working on this has to see something for it. So you need a few things to happen. We usually talk about having a catalytic project that'll generate something, and different places approach that in different ways, but you want to see something happen within the first 5 years. But the real kick comes in, a decade or two later, really, I would say. Who else?
Well, right now, Anderson's got former apartment houses being renovated to attract young people. We've got at least 4 that are being renovated. So how do we attract the business now that will employ these people so they don't have to drive in and out?
So I think that there's a chicken and egg aspect to some of this, right? What do you do first? Well, you kind of got to do everything. So, and if everything was dependent on everything else, you could never do anything. So to some degree, you just have to get started. Part of the strategies people have used early on, if you already have somebody actually renovating housing, that's a good thing. My guess is there'll be demand for some limited amount for sure, just given the way the demographics are. But to really get it going, again, you want to start livening up the place so that the next folks want to put something in there too. That could be, simple projects that take spaces you have and activate them more. It can be done with events. You know, in my community, for instance, in a sort of main street that we were converting from suburban strip where nobody walked to the place I was talking about. Part of that was doing a few festivals. At that point, we have a blues festival in June. We close off one of the streets, you know. It's just one day, but thousands of people come after you've done this for a year or two. Everybody knows it's a party to go to. And they start learning about the area and they start getting interested in the area, you know, and you start changing the feel of it. It becomes a place that you want to be. And if you have a regular series of events that's drawing people, well, then those businesses get, you know, it's a little easier to keep your store going, your restaurant going, because there's more people coming in. And that pushes things. And you're trying to build some momentum that, you know, eventually will get other entrepreneurial-minded people thinking about, oh, this is a good place, I should open my business. There are lots of different ways you can work as a community to activate space and to attract folks to do things. I mentioned the use of legacy buildings. Well, how hard or easy is that to do? In most places I know of, there's always obstacles that could be dealt with. And you know, I'd look at that. I'd say, you know, if look around, ask the people who've done something, like the guy who's got the whiskey business or something like that. So how hard was this to do? What did you run into? What were the problems? And you know, see where you can streamline some processes, change the rules. We used it, you know, we replaced our zoning with a form-based code, and that attracted a bunch of people to look at it. Oh, we can build something different than we were, you know, able to do before. And not only that, but that's what everyone else is going to be building. So now I'm part of something. It's not just my piece of property. You know, these things build on themselves, and you need to get enough things going that are kind of little stuff as you're working to bigger stuff. And there really is that there's what you can do in a year, there's what you can do in 3 years, in 5 years, you know, and then the rest of it is going to build out over a much longer period of time. Not everything works, and you have disappointments, but you start getting something going, and you start feeling it to be a different place.
I'm kind of curious about the process and the timeline question that was asked earlier. You mentioned a catalytic event that happens early. You said within 5 years. That feels like a really long time to go without. And I was curious if a lot of these cities did go about it that way, where you put together, you got the requirements and a planning that takes a few years, and then they get their big budget and they get the funds, and then they start putting things into practice in a big chunk. Or are there any cities that did some more of an iterative, incremental method?
Well, I don't know that I see those as different. I mean, I would say everybody is doing this stuff in some iterative, incremental way. Okay. Because you have to. It's a question of how long the iterations are.
Yeah.
And how long it takes to get to where your first thing is really happening. Mm-hmm. And I would say that there's places I've been where they seem to put it together pretty fast and really got going pretty well. It's, you know, talking to the mayor of Greenville, it seemed to me like he got a lot going really fast, but I'm not so sure that that's not just my perception, that it actually took him a lot of years to get the first of it going. Mm-hmm. Compared to my own experiences, I got to tell you, it took way too long as far as I was concerned. You know, I served 18 years. I was elected 5 times to the county board, and I tell people I never planned it that way. You know, I didn't think I would do that much time. But you know, part of it was I didn't want to leave until I felt like I was done with, you know, what I'd started. I would say that we had a frustrating 4 or 5 years to get going. Mm-hmm. I generally don't tell people the story because I don't want to discourage anybody. We had a ridiculous number of meetings, and you know, we thought a fair consensus on what should happen, and it wasn't happening. And then we sort of started again and took a different tack, and then things started moving. So, you know, again, with more time, I can tell you more about what I think about how you don't make some mistakes that we made, maybe things you can do to accelerate it. I think it does pay to talk to some folks who've had, you know, more luck doing more things more quickly. But some of it really has to do with local institutions and culture. Part of the problem, my community, what's great about it is everyone wants to be involved and engaged. And there are a lot of people who will contribute, who have something to offer. And when we were done, this is a plan the community owned, and they would defend and support, and that was really great. The bad thing is, everybody needs to be involved and engaged in everything, and it's a lot of talking, you know. So, you know, that's part of it. And then you just run into things like you're all ready to go, and then the economy tanks. And you're waiting, you know, we had some delays simply because right when people were ready to go, there was no financing. One of the biggest projects we got actually happened because the family that owned the property decided to finance it themselves in the middle of the recession. You know, in the winter of 2009, they went ahead and built and opened in 2011. And you know, it was the project we needed, and it could easily not have happened, but they decided they wanted to do it. So I don't know if this is a good answer to your question or not, responsive, but I think that in some places where the government has more, where somebody elected mayor gets to do stuff and just say we're doing it, you know, then you can do things. You can do good things fast. You can also do bad things fast.
Right.
But you know, places, I came from very consensus-oriented places, and I had 3 votes to do anything. But there are places that are more complicated than that, take longer. You know, the best thing you can do to accelerate it is to build a popular consensus, because this stuff can't come entirely top down. You know, the people who are elected are not going to make bold moves if they think that it's political suicide to do it. Or if they think it's just a little bit risky, they're going to hold back. But if they see that there's a movement where we're all committed, there's a lot of people behind wanting to do something, then they will do it, and their successors will continue it. I mean, that's the thing, is they're coming, people like me come and go from government, but a lot of things that I worked on are still happening because they're in place because the community is behind it. And, you know, it doesn't matter who's in it. So, you know, I think that's the thing is, I don't want people to discourage it. It takes a while to actually make it. It does take a while. But you can start seeing changes really soon. And you got to look for the things. What are the things we can do in short order? You know, there are things you can do with paint. You know, you can create spaces, you can do pop-up things, and create excitement. And tell people about the big project that's coming. Dr. Reed.
How do you, I wonder, balance the what you want to do in your city with the poverty, the low income, people who are struggling all around the town center. We live in Park Place, and that just across over the bridge, just over the bridge. And I know there are other communities very close to downtown that would have similar stories, but a tight little community, but the homes are just going, for the most part, downhill. And you know, to go over the bridge and you're in the city where we have some really energetic things that have happened and are going on, but people still have to live, and what they can afford are going to be these rentals that just aren't kept up. So, I mean, you still want to put your energy and your positive thought into what's going on, but we can't, what is it, you know, if that's going to take quite a while to get going, then how do we bring the rest of the community into this? And where does the money go? Which, I mean, you have to have the money, and if it's going into developing your downtown, what about the money that's needed to make differences surrounding downtown?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So first, let me say, when I said that everybody in the community really needs to be involved, engaged to do this right, I did mean everybody. So that includes the people, you know, it's not just the people who are, you know, major stakeholders in the sense that they have, you know, they own a lot of property and their businesses, those people, of course. But it also does mean all the people who live here, including the people, you know, at the lowest income level. You know, we're all citizens and equal in this effort. And I think it's really important to approach it that way, both because I think it's right, but also because I think that's the only way in the long run you're going to be successful with it. And that means that in the end, everybody has to think they've got a stake in this. They've got to believe they're going to get something out of it. So if people in those communities don't see something's going to benefit them, they're not going to be too crazy about it. But it is possible to do things in a way that will bring benefits to everyone, especially if they're at the table and, you know, have the chance to, you know, have some input into it. If you're talking about something that is going to create value, so, you know, on the one hand, the question of where does the money come from? Well, you know, people are going to make money on this if it's successful, so money will be generated from it. Part of the answer I say, you know, to people, well, what are we putting all this into downtown? The answer is it's going to generate revenue that you can use everywhere to do everything you need to do. You know, it's going to support your schools, it's going to support programs that can benefit everybody. Again, you have to have the right understanding with the people in leadership that that's what's going to happen. And there are specific ways you can capture value to provide direct benefits to people, you know, who most need it. So, for instance, in my community, one of the things we did, because we did anticipate tremendous rise in value because it was already happening. So we put in mechanisms to leverage that to ensure that we'd still have housing affordable to the people who live there currently. Because that corridor I was talking about, where I happen to live, is the most diverse in my community. It has most of the remaining housing affordable to people of lower income that isn't, subsidized housing. It's market rate housing, which means it's the most at risk. So our plan was, we're not pushing anybody out of the boat. We counted, we inventoried, we found out what the housing stock was, and we said, when we're done, more people will live here, and a lot of them will have higher incomes. But we want all the people who live here now, at whatever their income is, to be able to live here then. Now, in reality, years later, it'll be different people, but the idea is that anyone who lives there now should be able to live there in the future. And that was about capturing the value and setting policies in place that would ensure we create enough essentially committed affordable housing long term. So, I mean, that's a long answer, but it's not long enough. There's really a lot you have to do. It's not a small thing. And dealing with that and the impact on adjacent communities is one of the most important parts of the process. I'll go here, and then somebody over here was asking.
Yes, would you suggest doing like a survey to see what your city wants in order to present it to the city council, in order to to let them know that people are behind doing something like that?
It's one of the things you can do.
Cleaning up the city or something like that.
Sure.
Because I really feel like if a survey and enough people, sign or, a petition or something like that, I think it will spark some kind of motivation.
I mean, there are a lot of things like that you can do and should do, and no one of them is enough.
Right.
So yeah, that can be part of it. You again, you have to be prepared to be at this for a while, and it's a lot of meetings and a lot of talking and a lot of arguing at some point. It ultimately is a creative process, so it can be very exciting. But yeah, you have to be engaging people in every way you can, and that's one way to do it. I like a lot of face-to-face engagement because I think that's really important. At some point, it's a certain amount of sitting around rooms like this where you listen to somebody talk, but at some point it's sitting around tables, with maps of the city, or if you're part, where you live, your neighborhood, and everybody with the markers, and actually drawing things up, and then, working on it iteratively and collectively, and that's the hard and also interesting, exciting process, but it can be supplemented by lots of things. We did a thing where we had a lot of people assembled, for instance, for part of our design exercise, and people had clickers where they could, so we actually did the voting right in the room, so we would show them things and they could vote, and then we'd see, and then they could see what everybody voted, what everybody thought, right? And there's a lot of things you can do that, and any one of them, is just what it is, but collectively, cumulatively, I think it has an effect in not only gauging what people think, but also helping people to form. People start seeing that their neighbors agree with them on a whole bunch of stuff and don't agree with them on some things. And people will then find their way to, what can we get behind? We don't do enough of that. We're passive a lot in it, right? We vote once in a few years, and then we go home, and then we complain about all the people we voted for. But we don't have as much opportunity to actually engage and really kind of do democracy ourselves. This is one of the few ways you actually can at the local level. You can assert yourself and be part of the process of deciding what the future of your community is going to be. It's there. Let me take one on that side before I come back over here. Yeah.
So I think the difference between Anderson, Madison County, and Greenville is our proximity to capital. And there are a lot of people who live in community to and need to work. What would be your suggestions for us to capitalize on that location while still doing this sort of localized place building?
Well, I think that's actually an advantage you have because, people need employment somewhere, and that's demand. And if there are people, if this is a place people would want to live, then, a certain number of people could be commuters. And,
like 20%.
Yeah. And then that might even be higher, right? But part of what this is suggesting is that there are more people who will want to live in a kind of place. If they want the suburban house they have now, and they live in an interstate community, well, then they're already here, right? But if you're trying to capture a little bit more of what's spilling out from there, again, you got to meet the demand that's there, and you're competing with places that will offer that. So, if what I want is, a nice place that feels like a town, and where I'm close to stuff, and where I can walk to things, but I don't necessarily want to be all the way downtown Fort Wayne. I want it a little smaller. This might be what I'd want. The downtown that this could be might be just the right thing for me, even though I'm going to commute down to the Capitol to, my job down there. It's the same thing. I think it's meeting a demand that's out there for which there's insufficient supply currently. I think you were reading.
Actually, that was my question.
Oh, how efficient.
I know, right? Nothing else.
Somebody else.
Well, your lifestyle apartment in downtown Fisher is gonna be a heck of a lot. Your income from Indy spent here in Anderson or Alec, we love having Alec, is gonna go a heck of a lot further. And if we can add those amenities to it, I mean, by all means, we absolutely need to.
Well, I guess my thought is, the one thing I really need when you talk about is transportation.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can find a way to get people to and from work in a more efficient way, I think that's a sell. If I can buy more house here or live downtown here, I can't do that in Fisherton Carmel. And I can hop on the bus and, get into work.
Right. So you're right, I didn't talk about that, but that's a good point, because one of the benefits of having, a little more concentration of population is that you can make that efficient to do. It's hard to run, even say a commuter bus service and people are spread out all over the place, even if there's one place they're going. If there's a big core of people who can, who are going to be near that downtown and I can pick them up there, then I can maybe do an efficient bus service. And so, commuter bus service then could be very viable and could be part of my lifestyle. And, I don't really want to drive in every day. I can work on the bus and, not waste that time. And that, one plays off the other. So the greater population in the town makes that possible, but also the bus then makes it easier to go live there. Other questions, points, yeah.
You mentioned having a gatekeeper to kind of help manage, once this happens, but also I imagine help the momentum of a revitalization process.
Place manager.
Yeah, it's kind of, and I'm thinking beyond the mayoral office or city council that has, especially Anderson, turning over.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the 20-year longevity that Greenfield does. So I lived in a town of Arkansas for 5 years, and they had a great revitalization there downtown using a nonprofit organization called Main Street.
Yeah.
Have you seen those?
Oh, lots of them. That's why I said there's a lot of ways it's done.
Well, how do all of us get in a room with that organization like that?
And that is part of the function, actually, is being the next.
Here, but it's unattended and unused.
So
how do we?
Ames, Anderson, Indiana, Main Street.
Yeah.
You want to join the board? Give me your name.
That's
for anybody in this room.
So the answer may be that you have a vehicle.
Okay.
It's been sitting vacant. It's been sitting
Because
unused
it's so
for 8 to 10
successful
years.
in my town of Arkansas,
Yeah.
I help with it, I volunteer, so I would love to.
Does it have a staff person?
No.
Yeah.
Not
So one of the ways it could work, there's a lot of different ways, but one way it can work is you get an organization like that and it gets a staff person, at least one person. So we had one that on the street that I was talking about in my community that started like in the 80s. And the county agreed to put in a little bit of money, and then there's some money from some businesses, and it's a private nonprofit. But it's never employed more than 2.5 people or something like that. But that means there's somebody who is making sure the banners get put up and taken down. They store them when they're out of season. That's the person who's going to organize the festivals. And then I didn't mention it, farmers market, which is a weekly thing. Everybody comes to the farmers market, and and there's somebody doing that. And you can do an awful lot with a ridiculously underpaid person, because somehow those people seem to be around who will do this stuff. And if you can pay a little bit more, then you can start to actually staff up and do some of the other functions. You have to have somebody though who is doing that and who calls the meetings, because a lot of our planning happened through the facility of this. The person who ran that was always in touch with everybody: business owners, landowners, the neighborhoods, all the active citizens, and would convene them. And that somebody has to perform that function. You have to figure out who that's going to be. We kind of have to agree who it is. This kind of worked because that body had a board, and that board had representation. There are 10 neighborhoods all around. Every one of them had a representative on it. Their major, their business, property owner representatives, and the government had a representative on it. And it was a good mechanism there for trying to find consensus, which a lot of times that's not easy, and you don't agree and all that, but at least you got a place to bring everybody together. And in the end, we all know we all want the same thing in the end here. We want this to be a great place. We all have some stake in it. Other questions, comments? No? Well, thank you all very much. It's been great to be here again. I can't wait to come back and see what you do with it.